To hand over to Mitzi now. Just as a brief introduction, Mitzi is a full-time climate justice activist based in Metro Manila in the Philippines. She's involved in a number of organizations, including Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, the Fridays for Future of the Philippines, and is on the steering committee of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and Youth Climate Justice Fund. Mitzi is joining from New York, where she is attending New York Climate Week events. So over to you, Mitzi. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Um, and thank you so much for the previous presenter for the really grounding um, conversation. I think when I, and it's great that we're starting to see more and more anti-militarization and climate justice panels. But in general, when I'm in peace and justice conversations, sometimes we don't start and talk about Palestine or even mention it, and it's just a vague, hey, there's an injustice in the world right now. And it feels very floaty, and it's like we should name it at the very least, because it's all in our hearts right now, and it is a representation of what's happening everywhere, and it's really like one of the largest things happening. But to talk about climate justice and militarization in the Philippines, I need to take a tiny step back and oops, I don't know if you guys can see this. I need to take a tiny step back and uh, talk about land justice in the Philippines. Um, Let me just, am I sharing my screen properly?
Yeah, we can see that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry, because I lost the Zoom completely now, but cool, I'm here. Um, so climate justice and land justice is how I'm going to explain anti-militarization in the Philippines. I often end up talking in more climate spaces, so the militarization part, they're like, what, why? But land justice, people usually understand. Very briefly, the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries to the climate crisis, yet we contribute less than 1%. And some of the most vulnerable people to the climate crisis are the peasants. So in the Philippines, those are the small farmers, the small fisher folk, indigenous peoples, because their livelihoods are the ones that are really devastated, and their livelihoods is also where they live, and it's also related to their culture. And largely talking about monocrop plantations. This is a large cause of emissions and land degradation and biodiversity loss. And we all have seen multiple studies of how when you give peasants their land, the land becomes healthier. So this is a deep dive into the Philippines, well, not a deep dive, a dive into the Philippines anti-colonialism, anti-imperialist fight, and how everyone, especially in the global north, can actually really play a big role. To start, I want to talk about how I became a climate activist in the first place. This was in 2017. I'm beside the person with the blue flag, if you can see. You probably can't. I was a students' rights activist, and I met Indigenous students and Indigenous peoples who went on a journey called the Lakbayan ng Pambansang Minoria, which is translated to the Journey of the National Minorities. It's an annual march, rally, and camp out by minority peoples of the Philippines to protest against human rights violations and exploitation of their ancestral lands. And here I really started to understand why students' rights movements, why environment movements, and why anti-militarization movements need to start coming together. In this moment, I was able to meet Indigenous students, and the way that Indigenous students or Lumad students are in the Philippines is that they have set up their own schools, because in the ancestral land, in the rural areas where they live, in the forests where they live, the government isn't really there. And so there is no public schools, there's no private schools, definitely. And so they set up their own schools. And the way that they set up their education is one that is in line with Indigenous sovereignty, in the sense that when they talk about math and fractions, it's about how they divide the land, because they're farmers. And when they talk about values, they talk about Indigenous values. And this was a threat to the government. And so their schools were bombed, closed. Militaries were surrounding them constantly, and they were being harassed and displaced and militarized. I had a very concrete conversation with one of their Indigenous leaders who was telling us about how they were again, being displaced, and how their women were being raped, how their students were being harassed, how their communities were overrun by militaries, all because they were going up against large-scale mining industries, all because they were going up against hydro dams. They were protecting the land that they were on. They were protecting the planet that we are on. These 5 people, especially one of the people here, mean a lot to me because Chad Book, who's on the left, he was a volunteer teacher in math, and he was a friend and one of the people who encouraged me when I was starting out my journey as a full-time activist. And in February 2022, he was killed alongside 4 other volunteers. Jurain Nguyo, Elegine Balonga, Tirsa Anyar, and Robert Aragon, collectively termed as New Bataan 5. The Army of the Philippines says that he was one of those killed in a supposed encounter between the rebel groups and the military. But this claim has been disputed by many community members and the forensic pathologists. They were simply visiting the other community to see if their schools were okay. The Philippines is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for environmental defenders. So this is a report from Global Witness. And why is it so dangerous? It's because they're fighting back. One of the things that the Lumad indigenous leader told me on that day in September 2017, during the Lakbayan, was that because their home, because their land, because their people are under attack, they have no choice but to fight back. And this is a climate fight because, as a very concrete example, in 2016, there was the Kidapawan massacre. Here, 3,000 farmers protested and blocked the highway to call for government assistance after drought caused by El Nino hit their farms. So before it escalated to blocking a highway, they tried all the other things. They tried the dialogues, they tried asking, they've tried. And that didn't work. So, they did their civil right to protest. And instead of giving them rice, so that's what they were asking for. They were just asking for bags of rice to survive, to continue their business, to continue living. But instead of delivering aid, the police and military stormed the protesters' barricade with an open fire, killing farmers and wounding hundreds. And this continues. In 2016, cops tried to disperse a rally of peasants and indigenous peoples protesting alleged military and US presence in their lands. And the police set off tear gas, drove a police vehicle through the protesters' ranks. This is how the police and military protect, especially in the Philippines, the US. The most intense mobilizations that we have in the Philippines are the ones that are in front of the US Embassy. Why? We'll get to that later. So a little bit of an understanding of the Philippine peasantry. The vast majority of peasantry in the Philippines lack adequate land to till or no land at all. 7 out of 10 do not have their own land. And this isn't just happening in the Philippines. And majority of the Philippines is still agricultural land. So majority of our people are farmers, fisher folks. And how did the system come about? It was through the colonization of the Philippines. So the whole hacienda system started with the Spanish colonization that we had, and the US maintained this system. So after 300 years of colonization under Spain, we won with the Philippine Revolution of 1896, but they did not want to win. They did not want us to win, so they sold us to the US alongside Cuba, Guam, I think Peru. I'm just learning about the other countries that were sold along with us because we thought it was just us all this time. And it was a small amount. So knowing that there were other countries with us makes the value even less. And when we won and they sold us to the US then invaded. There was a massive war again. And not really a war, it was also a genocide. And the large-scale land owned by landlords set up by Spain, when the US came, they kept it and they intensified it, and thousands of peasants were massacred. And why did the US colonize the Philippines? And really, why did any colonizer colonize any country? It's because of the resources. It's because of the greed. And what does that do to the planet? That continuous idea that you can just take and take and take from a finite resource planet. And to add to that, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the term white saviorism. So the stems of that come from the white man's burden. So in 1899, a poem written by a British imperialist poet actually wrote a poem to encourage the US to take on the incredible burden of, quote unquote, turning the barbaric Filipinos into civilized people. And so, what does that look like today? Today, the US military, as mentioned earlier, is the largest single institution carbon emitter in the world. Not sure if it was mentioned earlier, and we all know that the US is already one of the most historic polluters in the world. But remember that their military emissions aren't counted in that numbers because the US lobbied to get rid of that accountability. And now it's there, but it's optional. So countries don't do it. And so the US military now, they train our military alongside the Australian and sometimes the Japanese military. And they have annual shoulder to shoulder exercises that are developed to, quote unquote, develop the security relationship between the two countries' armed forces through crisis action planning, enhanced training, mostly to conduct counterterrorism operations and the US led war on terror. And last year, what they did was a live fire exercise at sea, putting local marine life at risk and risking security and safety and livelihood of coastal communities. And our government said it's worth it for the protection of the country if the fisher folk need to ensure a little bit of quote unquote disturbance. But what does counterterrorism look like for the US? And now that they're training our military, it means drones, jet fighters, military aircrafts, gunfires, indiscriminate bombings and shellings in different rural areas. It means schools being bombed. It means people being killed. People who are simply fighting back. And that's also why we have no choice but to fight back, because this is life and death. That is what the climate crisis is. I don't need to explain and add even more how all of that then adds up to our vulnerability to the climate crisis, how the deforestation that's happening around that is causing the floods that's happening in the cities, how the military is also now slowly starting to enter the city, and they used the COVID pandemic to really start to normalize that, where police started wearing military fatigue and holding large guns. And so now if you see military in the city, it's not a weird sight when it used to be. If you really think about what is causing the climate crisis, it's this imperialist, profit-oriented system that's taking and taking and taking. And people in the global north, but especially in the global south, through fossil fuel industries and companies, are really feeling it. And so how do we fix it? We change the system. We bring down imperialism. We take their power. And where do the imperialists get their power? They get it from land, from nature, from resources, from cheap labor, from people. And so it's time for us to reclaim our power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitzi. That was really powerful. Thank you.